Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. So the topic of this podcast is homelessness, and we have a special guest this week, Paul Cho, who is the CFO of LifeArk, an organization that has designed a modular building system, 3D printing actually, to help house homeless and low-income families, and they've been very successful.
Yeah, it's a really interesting program, and as you hear more about the concept, and I encourage everybody, Google their Monte project and see for yourself what it looks like. It makes a lot of sense, and when you hear Paul explain it, it'll make you start to ask, well, why are we spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on these other projects that usually fail to deliver? Why aren't we spending homeless dollars more on programs like this? But again, it's government, and this makes too much sense. So I've probably answered my own question.
The spoiler alert here, but Paul had mentioned in the interview that it was under $200,000 to build a unit using their design. Whereas I'm sure that many of our listeners have read in the paper, especially Los Angelinos, the auditor reported that Measure HHH dollars were producing housing units that were upwards of $700,000, $800,000 per unit. Amazing.
And it's not only Los Angeles. You expect it's going to be crazy red tape and costs around every corner when you're building something in Los Angeles. Our Kerry Jackson, Wayne Weingart have just written about a Project Home Key project in San Diego that is going to get about $12 million in state funds and another $11 million in county funds. So we kind of did the math, and this project is called the Path Villas El Cerrito project. They are on track to build about 41 new housing units. Well, do the math. That would be a cost of over $560,000 per unit. So it's no wonder we're not getting much for our housing dollars when we're putting it all in programs like this and not looking at innovative ideas like LifeArk.
That's right, Tim. And I'm looking forward to the care court idea that Newsom had put forth, and really think that this idea is very interesting. So in a nutshell, if you're a family or a close friend or even a first responder or say a social worker will be able to petition for a person with mental illness to qualify for the care court. And with the care court, they would have a clinical evaluation. And if they're approved, they would get legal counsel. They will get a care plan, which would include treatment, medication, housing for 12 months. And if they fail, the person may be considered for conservatorship. So I think that's a real incentive for someone to receive treatment rather than just kind of warehousing them and leaving them alone and watch them fail again and back on the street.
It's going to be a 2-year program rollout. So 7 counties will be starting the program by October of 2023, and every other county will be online by the end of 2024. And counties will be getting about $63 million to help with implementing the program. And so I think it is definitely a step in the right direction of what must be done to get folks who can't help themselves in a position to, through tough love, get the help they need to turn their lives around. And, it's clear that we need to do something different. We've been seeing all of the different counties roll out their point-in-time counts of homeless, and virtually every county you're seeing homelessness numbers go up. We just saw LA County, which we're picking on a lot today. They rolled out their figures recently, and the figures went up about 4.1% from 2020. About 42% of the homeless are within the city of LA, and 69,000 overall are homeless in the county on any given night. Now, it was interesting to watch the coverage of it. The government officials are kind of, patting themselves on the back. Well, the last figures that they put out, homelessness had gone up 25.9%. Well, is that really anything to celebrate? It's still going up. Yeah, maybe it's not going up as much, but it's still going up. So it's clear that something different needs to be done, and programs like LifeArk that we're talking today may just be what we need to be focusing on.
And here is Paul Cho. Welcome to Next Round, Paul.
Thank you for inviting me.
So LifeArk is a firm that has developed a modular building system that can create entire communities on land and sea. Its focus is housing for the homeless, for low-income populations, and even disaster relief potentially. So please tell us about LifeArk and how it got started, its mission, and about this modular building concept.
Right. Well, LifeArk was invented by Charles Wee, who is a renowned architect. He built many skyscrapers, primarily in Asia, in Korea and China. But he has a cousin who is a missionary in the jungles of Amazon. And when he visited his cousin about 8 years ago, he noticed that the indigenous people really did not have stable housing because the water fluctuation of the Amazon River is up to like 20 feet per year. So for most of the year, the natives were essentially flooded out of their homes. So because of that, they really lived in poverty, not having access to stable housing. So Charles decided to invent housing that would float on water in order to address the issues of the natives. And he really came up with this great idea of using plastic that is rotomolded with foam insulation, just like our Yeti or Igloo coolers, because we know that would float. So he developed the modular housing concept in order to serve the natives not only in Amazon, but we have a lot of vulnerable communities that are affected by rising seawater. Or live in floating slums around the world. So that was his primary goal in inventing this modular housing. But I met him about 6 years ago. And my background is, I'm a co-founder of Illumination Foundation, which is a homeless services provider here in Southern California. We're one of the largest recuperative care providers in the nation. But when I ran into him about 6 years ago and saw what his concept with this floating housing, I immediately recognized that the modular housing that Charles invented had potential application to tackle the homelessness right here in our backyard. So we have been working with Charles for the past 6 years and really detouring his overall development process to take it through California, the most rigorous and convoluted permitting and approval process anywhere in the world. It was a real challenge, but having gone through it with all of the fire tests, the seismic tests, all the life safety issues that are now a part of the modular system design and fully approved for right here in California, we're comfortable that this product can serve not only California, but also the needs throughout the world, knowing that it will be that same great product that has been certified. But this is such a different product from any other modular system that I've run across. And, we've been, because of the issue of housing, when we were working with the homeless, we've been looking at different modular solutions. But when we saw the LifeArk concept, we recognized, and it has turned out to be a tremendously cost-effective as well as a very truly innovative. We think that it'll really be a disruption to the overall housing industry in how we think about housing going forward.
Paul, I just want to follow up on what you said about the bureaucracy that it takes to build anything in California. We've got a project on CEQA to help reform it, the California Environmental Quality Act. So maybe you could expand on some of the issues that you had to go through trying to put your concept to real working community.
Right. I mean, we know that California is one of the most bureaucratic states in the world, in the U.S. That's why there were times through this long process when we said, we should have done this in Texas or in other places where you can build anything you want. But, I think having gone through the process and recognizing that we had to go through a lot of different regulation in order to get the necessary approvals. But I think having gone through this very difficult process has also given us confidence that we have a great product that can be used anywhere in the world. But I think in order for us we really had to do this in California also because we were trying to tackle the homelessness issue right here in our backyard. And we wanted to have LifeArk become a factory-built housing program with all of our modular designs approved by California's HCD, so that that would minimize any local processes when we were ready to develop the housing.
So here at PRI, we've been looking at the homeless issue for many years now. And, we're seeing California has been spending hundreds of millions of dollars to house the homeless. And yet it seems that taxpayers get very little bang for their buck. We recently saw the auditors in Los Angeles put out a study on how local measure HHH dollars were spent this year. And they found that the city has spent, on average, about $700,000 per unit of housing. And in one upcoming development, as much as $827,000. So as the CFO of a housing construction firm, what do you think are driving these high costs?
Right. When we look at the cost of housing, we know all of these costs have been increasing, but particularly when it comes to affordable housing, we're seeing a lot of media attention on this tremendously high cost of affordable housing. I mean, you mentioned some of the housing that's costing $827,000 or so, but we've seen affordable housing that is in excess of 1 million. Obviously, there's something wrong when you are building affordable housing at $1 million plus. But I think there are cost increases at both the hard cost level as well as the soft cost level. The hard cost, we're seeing material cost increase, not only more recently from inflation, but we saw during the pandemic, the supply chain problems that caused lumber prices to quadruple at times. So that really went into a lot of the increase in costs. Also, the issue of prevailing wage. When we have the public funds involved in these developments, we need to pay labor at the prevailing wage level, which is significantly higher than what is market. And then throughout the whole process of construction, which is usually 3 to 6 years for these affordable housing, the long timeline itself contributes to increase in hard costs due to the general contractor, the contingencies that they have, as well as building that into their budget. The overall construction costs increase. But I think what we really see as an even bigger cost factor in the so-called affordable housing is the soft costs. When you look at the Measure HHH project, the report that was done by the LA controller, the report indicated that about 30% of the Measure HHH projects are soft costs. Basically the permits, fees, financing fees, legal, accounting. And when you have so much of the overall development costs going out as soft costs, that just increases the total project exponentially. Because of the high costs, you also have to bring in so many different capital sources, whether it be tax credits, local public funds, state public funds. So when you have multiple sources of capital, each source involves a lawyer. So all of the additional work that goes into trying to put together that development package just becomes tremendously expensive. And on top of that, obviously, there are the high permit costs at the local level. So trying to build affordable housing, again, at these extremely high costs just is not sustainable. And we hear about the housing crisis on a daily basis. But until we can find different ways of building housing, we are just not going to even make a dent in the housing crisis that we have today.
And so, Paul, how is it that LifeArk can build housing for so much less and a lot faster?
Well, and this is where I think the uniqueness of LifeArk, in which it's the material that we're using, which is plastic. It's high-density polyethylene plastic. And it's although it's the raw material comes from oil or petrochemical based products, the pricing of that raw material as that we've seen is not as volatile as wood, steel, concrete in the construction industry. So even during the pandemic days with the supply chain issues, the pricing for our raw materials has not gone up as much as the other materials that's used in the traditional construction industry. But also, I think the overall design of our LifeArk modules, the way it gets assembled is such a simple process. The cost of labor involved is much lower. It's a much quicker process. So I think those factors have gone into lowering the cost dramatically, as we've seen in our first project in El Monte, where it is homeless housing project, but our per unit price is less than $190,000 per unit, which obviously is very competitive compared to the other major HHH dollar funded projects. And I think the other factor behind the low cost of our project is the design as well. And we've utilized a design where we have a large shared common space, which works right into the way we program the supportive services. But what that in essence did was create much smaller private space for the individuals, and so the overall number of unit count we could increase, although the overall design, again, works so much better for these individuals that we work with. Well, also, actually, I forgot to mention, our soft costs were only 12% of the total capital stack, which obviously, compared to the 30%, that's really where a lot of the savings comes out as well. And the reason for such a low percentage is we have a very simple capital stack. The total project cost of our project was $3.6 million. Of which $1 million came from LACTA, because we won the LA County Innovative Housing Challenge back in 2018. We used that as the seed money to purchase the land as well as get the project started. And then we got a $2.1 million construction loan that just converted into permanent loan from nonprofit finance fund. So really, in essence, we only have those two sources plus the balance being the owner's equity. So I think that very simple capital stack also contributed to total project cost being much lower than the other developments using public funding.
So at PRI, we've been critics of quote unquote housing first policies, which says that the priority must be to find and get homeless into housing before anything else. In the view of our scholars, the problem with these policies is that without mandating things like sobriety or mental health treatment or addiction counseling, many people are going to be right back out on the streets again. So what's your perspective on this issue?
I mean, when HUD changed their overall philosophy to housing first, I guess it's been almost 10 years now. I think they did it with the goal of trying to get the homeless house as quickly as possible. And I think it's had successes as well as, there's been issues. But the two biggest weaknesses that I see in the housing first philosophy is that one, the lack of permanent housing means that people are staying on the street longer. Because the focus is getting them housed right into permanent housing as quickly as possible. But we don't have the permanent housing available. And it takes time to build the permanent housing. So we're ending up with the people staying on the street much longer. So I think in addition to trying to get permanent housing, we need to build more shelter beds and interim housing. And then the second overall, weakness to the housing first concept is that one size does not fit all. I think housing first works really well for the homeless who are much more independent or those who became homeless pretty recently. Because in those situations, you just provide them just a little bit of a hand up and they'll make it on their own, even without any follow-on supportive services. But, our nonprofit has been working with the most vulnerable. The recuperative care program takes clients coming out of the hospital system. So they not only have the medical issues, but for the most part, they have the mental health issues as well as addiction issues. So when you're dealing with these very vulnerable homeless with comorbidities, if you put them into housing and just say, we're done, for the most part, they will not be successful. They really need ongoing supportive services. So, I think what we like to say is, yes, housing first is great, but you can't stop there. You need that community second, meaning you have to continue to provide services in order to make sure that they get connected into a community, which will essentially serve as a safety net for them, so that even when they have issues, they won't end up on the streets. They will be able to support themselves. And, that community focus is something that our nonprofit in working with homeless has really worked on, because we found that when we're dealing with these homeless individuals who's been on the street for 15, 20 years, and you get them into their own apartment, one bedroom, a studio, if you can find one, that oftentimes they actually don't do well because they're alone. They have social isolation issues. Even on the streets, they were part of that community, and not being a part of that community means that they're now beginning to fall into depression and they're ending up back on the street. So we've really focused our projects in trying to create that community environment where the homeless can come together and really form their own family unit so that they're supporting one another.
So, Paul, how about if you can chat about this pilot program of 19 units in El Monte, California? Tell us a little bit about that and how it's going.
Right. Our 19 units and it's made out of the LifeArk modular housing. And when we have visitors, we like to tell people that they're at the world's first fully certified and permitted plastic housing in the world. We know that there are a lot of unpermitted plastic housing like tough sheds or other unpermitted housing that people do use. But to get plastic housing to be approved as the primary structural element in a development was a challenge. But now that we've proven that it worked, people are just so excited about the possibilities. But the second component of our project is really in the design. As I mentioned, we designed this particular project with the community in mind. Of the 19 units, 1 unit is for the property manager and 18 units are for homeless individuals. Each individual gets essentially a small efficiency unit. They have about 200 square feet of their own private space, which has their own bed as well as their own private bathroom, which is really important for the homeless. But the important part of the design is that large community area. That people cook together, that they talk together, and that they really start creating the community. Our project opened in mid-April this year, and of the 18 units, 16 units we have tenants, and the remaining 2, our case management team is just finishing up the documentation so that they'll also join us shortly. But what we've seen in this community is, initially the homeless individuals pretty much stayed within their own units and really was not as comfortable in coming out and mingling in the common space. But now, when you go there, they're really cooking for each other. They're really, I can really see that community forming. I was there recently. And a new tenant who had come, he was telling me how when he came, the so-called mother of this project cooked him a meal that night. And then the following day, she cooked him breakfast as well. And he was so pleased with it. And I told him, don't get used to it because that's not what she'll be doing every day. She was just trying to make you feel welcome. But we can see how the individuals are coming together, beginning to support one another. That same person who is deemed to be the mother of the project, I saw her knocking on the door of another tenant the other day, telling him he needs to go to his medical appointment and that she's going to accompany him to get his medical appointment. So, when we see things like that, we know that this community is going to be successful long term and that they're not going to be cycling through the streets.
That's really wonderful, Paul. How do you pick the candidates for these units? And also, do you enforce sobriety, for example, or individuals going to their counselors and not taking drugs? Is that a requirement?
Oh, well, as far as the matching, it is done completely through the coordinated entry system organized through LASA. When there are vacant units, LASA will match individuals who are appropriate for our project to us. And then our case management team will go out, find them, and then do their documentation so that they're able to enter our project. As far as the lease, it is a standard lease. It's based on the Housing First philosophy. We are not allowed, all services are voluntary. They don't have to partake in supportive services, and it's harm reduction. If they are not allowed to do drugs within their unit, but we don't evict them just because they've been caught. We try to work with them. Our counselors, our substance use counselors, really work with them to allow them to get back on track, so to speak.
So this sounds like a terrific project. Do you see projects like what you're working on here in El Monte as something that could be replicated in other communities across California or even across the country? And, ultimately, what's your vision for LifeArk when you have it ramped up to its fullest? Would you see, initiatives like this all over the country or even all over the world?
We think that this model, not only using the LifeArk modules, but the design for creating that community space and the supportive services to really help the tenants of this project to form their own community so that they have their safety net within when they're really out looking after one another. At some point, we're hopeful that our case management team can pull back and they will be set completely on their own. And we see projects like this working very well, not only within our local area, but really throughout the nation. And this concept of community or shared housing really is very appropriate for this population. Because we know it's successful programmatically, but also at the same time, because each individual unit can be smaller, overall, we think that the project development costs will be much lower as well. So it's really a win-win solution on both ends, the facility side as well as the programmatic side. Now, our goal going forward is that this LifeArk El Monte project was a proof of concept. First time in the world, plastic housing has been built. We needed to demonstrate that it's viable. And now that we've demonstrated it, we're actually now moving forward in order to scale up our manufacturing. When we see a lot of the modular companies out there, one of the struggles that we see is that even the best modular housing concepts, it's very difficult to meet demand in orders, only because the scalability is limited. It's for the most part, the other modular housing concepts, you're still doing the same thing you're doing on-site, just off-site in a factory-controlled environment. You're still sawing, cutting, welding, using the traditional construction methods. You're just doing it in a factory-controlled environment. So there's a limit to how much you can really scale up. You still require the same labor in the factory setting. With LifeArk, because it literally is like a Lego block, it is much easier for us to be for us to scale up our product and make it available for essentially other developers, anyone who wants to build not only homeless housing. We think that this is very appropriate for senior housing, other affordable housing, so that we're able to focus on manufacturing it and getting it, making it available to the end users of these so-called Lego blocks to build whatever they need.
So Governor Newsom has made homelessness a priority in his administration. If you were an advisor to the governor, what would you tell him as far as mitigating the homeless crisis in the state?
Well, we've seen multiple rounds of the Initially, it was, I guess it was Home Key. I forget what it was before Home Key. But I think all this funding source coming down to try to get the homeless very quickly housed has become a great catalyst to build a lot more units, or to make units available to get the homeless off the street much more quickly. But we've seen how expensive it is. And while it was a great start, it's not sustainable to continue to put out funding for housing that is just so expensive. We know one of the root causes of homelessness is housing. So getting more houses built is important to solve homelessness. But we also, at the same time, I think we have a housing crisis. So we need to look at the root causes of the housing crisis and not just, put a Band-Aid solution together. And when I look at truly trying to solve the housing crisis, I think the governor should look at ways that will support more housing that can be built. For instance, we live in very antiquated building code or permitting process. We know that by changing some of the regulations that we have, we've already seen, for instance, the ADU law or SB 9 rules being enacted. Rules that will allow the whole building process to be much more simpler with lower permitting costs will be extremely helpful. But also, I think investing in new technologies for building. We've been building housing the same way, using the same materials, same techniques for centuries. And now we're seeing a lot of new innovations, whether it's 3D printing or like our LifeArk plastic modular housing. We're seeing a lot of new innovations and just completely different ways of thinking about how housing should be built. So I think continuing to make some investment in these newer innovations will really be important. We know, California is at the forefront of innovation. Bringing some disruptive innovations to the housing industry will really be great for California.
So finally, Paul, we call our podcast Next Round because we love nothing more than discussing public policy issues over a glass of wine. And so we ask all of our guests if they could offer a recommendation for our listeners for a favorite beer or wine or cocktail or otherwise beverage. So what are you enjoying these days as we're nearing the end of a warm California summer?
Well, to be truthful, I've been a teetotaler for the past 6 years since I became an elder at my church. But the past couple of weeks, when we've had this extremely hot weather, I get cravings for a nice cold beer. And I did find a solution, actually. I found a Heineken 0.0% non-alcoholic beer, which actually tastes just like the real thing. And it definitely hits the spot. So I've been enjoying that during these hot days.
I have seen those advertised. The last time I went to a Giants game, they were advertising those heavily. And I think if you signed up to be a designated driver, you got a coupon for one for free. So on your recommendation, I'm going to have to try one of those.
I was actually very surprised how genuine it tasted. So it really hit the spot during these past few weeks.
But what about the calories, Paul? That's what I worry about.
Well, I don't think they've made it 0 calorie. I don't think.
All right.
No, I will sacrifice some calories for the taste.
All right. Thanks so much, Paul. Appreciate you coming on.
No, not at all. It's my pleasure, and I appreciate you really trying to make some sense of the not only the homelessness crisis, but very closely linked to that is obviously the housing crisis. But we definitely have a lot of work ahead for California.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.